December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. The frozen forest of the Ardennes explodes. 1,600 German artillery pieces open fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The ground shakes like the earth itself is tearing apart. Trees splinter. Foxholes collapse. American soldiers who were sleeping seconds ago are now screaming, burning, dying in the dark. The sky turns orange, then red, then orange again. Artillery shells fall so thick and so fast that veterans who survived Normandy later said they had never heard anything like it. The thunder never stops. It just rolls and rolls and rolls across the Belgian countryside like God himself decided to end the war in a single morning. Within the first hour, entire American units simply cease to exist. Within the first day, the Germans punch a hole 50 miles deep into Allied lines. 3 American divisions are shattered. Thousands of men are dead, wounded, or running. And somewhere in a room in Versailles, France, the most powerful military commander in the Western world is staring at a map that keeps getting worse every time his staff updates it. But somewhere else, 175 miles to the south, a 3-star general with ivory-handled revolvers is already doing something that everyone around him thinks is absolutely insane. His name is George S. Patton, Jr., and in 72 hours, he is going to attempt the single most audacious military maneuver of the entire Second World War. To understand why what Patton was about to do was considered impossible, you have to understand what the Ardennes actually looked like in December 1944. Not on a map. In reality. The Ardennes forest is not the kind of place armies are supposed to fight. The trees grow so close together that tanks can barely squeeze between them. The roads are narrow, winding, carved through hills and valleys that channel movement into predictable kill zones. In summer, it's difficult. In December, with a foot of snow on the ground, temperatures dropping to single digits, fog so thick you can't see 20 feet in front of you, and ice turning every road into a skating rink, the Ardennes is not a battlefield. It is a graveyard. The Germans knew this. That's exactly why they chose it. Adolf Hitler's plan was called Operation Watch on the Rhine. 25 German divisions. 9 of them Panzer. More than 400,000 men. The objective was not simply to push the Allies back. The objective was to drive all the way to the port city of Antwerp, split the Allied armies completely in 2 and circle, and destroy 4 Allied armies in a single stroke, and force Britain and America to negotiate a separate peace. It was an insane gamble, a dying empire throwing its last chips onto the table. And for a terrifying 72 hours, it was working. The 106th Infantry Division had only been on the line for 5 days when the German offensive hit. 5 days. These were green troops replacements, men who had barely learned their positions. 2 of the division's regiments, the 422nd and the 423rd, were completely surrounded within hours. By December 19th, more than 8,000 American soldiers would surrender in a single mass capitulation. The largest single surrender of American forces in the entire European theater. The news traveling back to Allied High Command in Versailles was catastrophic. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, had assembled every senior commander he could reach. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, Air Marshal Arthur Tedder. They gathered around tables covered in maps, and none of the pictures those maps showed were good. The German offensive had achieved complete tactical surprise. American units were in full retreat across a massive front, and the critical crossroads town of Bastogne, a place where 7 roads converged in the middle of Belgian farm country, was about to be completely encircled by German panzer forces. If Bastogne fell, the Germans would have an open corridor to the Meuse River. And if they reached the Meuse, the entire Allied position in Belgium could collapse. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith wrote in his diary that week that Eisenhower looked 10 years older. That this was the worst crisis since D-Day. The Supreme Commander had managed perhaps 10 hours of sleep total across 4 days. He chain-smoked through every briefing. He reviewed the same maps again and again, searching for anything that looked like an opportunity instead of a disaster. The consensus in that room leaned toward caution. Reorganize. Withdraw to defensible lines. Wait for the weather to improve so Allied air power could operate. Build up supplies. A counteroffensive would require weeks to organize properly, perhaps a month. You simply could not pick up entire army corps and hurl them into a winter battle with 3 days' notice. It violated every principle of military logistics. Every staff officer in that headquarters knew it. Every textbook ever written about large-scale operations said it. The math simply did not work. And then the door opened. Nobody had called ahead. Nobody had requested authorization or scheduled a briefing. A man simply walked through the door of Eisenhower's conference room without knocking. Cavalry boots polished to a mirror shine, despite the mud and snow outside ivory-handled revolvers riding at his hips. Face weathered and hard from days of driving through winter cold. He had climbed into his personal jeep at 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy, France, 175 miles away, and driven through the night. Alone. Without telling anyone where he was going. Eisenhower looked up from his maps. According to General Omar Bradley, who was present in that room and recorded the moment in his memoir, Eisenhower's expression moved through surprise, then something between frustration and overwhelming relief. He shook his head slowly, and then he said it. God, it really is Patton. George Smith. Patton Jr. was 59 years old. He had graduated from West Point in 1909, competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Olympics, served under General Pershing. Chasing Pancho Villa in Mexico, led the first American tank attack in World War I, and spent the entire interwar period thinking and obsessing over a single question. How do you move armies faster than your enemy can react? He was brilliant. He was profane. He was egotistical in ways that made other generals physically uncomfortable. He had nearly destroyed his career twice with incidents of spectacular public stupidity, and Eisenhower had shielded him from being dismissed both times because Eisenhower understood something that the politicians and the critics did not. When the situation was desperate, when the position was lost, when every rational analysis said the fight was over, Patton was the only man in the Allied order of battle who could look at that analysis and simply refuse to believe it. Patton walked directly to the map without waiting for anyone to invite him. He studied the German penetration for a moment. Then he traced his finger along the southern edge of the Bulge, the area where the German flank hung exposed, where the enemy had punched forward so fast that their own supply lines were now stretched thin and vulnerable. And he said something that made half the men in that room think he had finally completely lost his mind. We can attack on the 22nd. December 22nd, 3 days away. Patton's Third Army was currently engaged in active offensive operations, 150 miles to the south, attacking toward the Saar River. To do what he was proposing, he would need to disengage 3 full divisions from active combat, turn them 90 degrees north, move 133,000 men, more than 3,000 tanks and tank destroyers, 11,000 vehicles, and countless tons of ammunition and fuel across roads that were already jammed with retreating First Army units and Belgian civilians fleeing the German advance. He would need to conduct reconnaissance of entirely new terrain, reorganize his supply lines, coordinate with multiple corps commanders, and then attack into the flank of the most powerful German offensive since the fall of France. All of it. In 72 hours. British Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, who was standing in that room later, wrote that he believed Patton had finally overreached. That what he was proposing was not bold, it was fantasy. It violated every principle of military logistics that anyone in that room had ever studied. Several officers objected simultaneously. A logistics officer pointed out that the roads were already impossible. A British liaison noted that Patton's supply lines would stretch beyond any sustainable limit. Even Bradley Patton's own immediate superior and one of his oldest friends said quietly, "George, are you certain about this?" Patton turned to him. "Brad," he said, and the exact words appear in Bradley's own memoir, This time the bastard stuck his head in a meat grinder. He turned back to Eisenhower. And this time, I've got hold of the handle. The room went very quiet. Then Eisenhower leaned forward and asked the question that everyone in that room needed answered. He asked it simply, directly, the way Eisenhower always cut through theater to find the truth underneath. When did you start planning this? Patton's answer changed everything. December 16th, the day the Germans attacked. While every other Allied commander was scrambling to understand what had happened, while staffs across the theater were still receiving damage reports and trying to piece together how large the German breakthrough actually was, Patton had already called his own staff together. He had ordered them to prepare 3 separate contingency plans for counterattacking the Bulge from different angles depending on how the situation developed. He had designated which divisions would move. He had alerted his supply officers. He had done everything within his authority to do without actually receiving orders to do it. Lieutenant General Harold Bull, Eisenhower's own operations officer, later wrote in his diary, "Patton had been planning this for 3 days, while the rest of us were still figuring out how bad things were. That's why he could make such an audacious promise. He'd already done the impossible part, the planning." Eisenhower stood. He walked around the desk until he was standing directly in front of Patton, face to face. He looked at him for a long moment, the way a man looks at someone he has known through years of triumph and catastrophe. Someone he has protected and punished and called back again and again, because the alternative was unthinkable. Then he said, "All right, George, you'll attack on the 22nd. He turned to the assembled commanders. "Gentlemen, General Patton has just made us a promise that sounds impossible. I've learned something about George over the years." He looked back at Patton. "When something sounds impossible, that's usually when he's most dangerous." The meeting ended. Commanders dispersed to their units. Patton got back in his jeep and drove through the night toward Nancy, arriving at 2:30 in the morning. His staff was waiting, their contingency plans spread across every table in the room. He walked in, looked around at the exhausted faces, and said 4 words. "We're going. Alert everyone." What those 133,000 men were about to do in the next 72 hours, through blizzards and ice and German panzers, blocking every road, had never been done before in the history of mechanized warfare. And deep in the frozen hell of Bastogne, 18,000 American soldiers, surrounded on all sides, out of ammunition, out of medical supplies, eating captured German rations in bombed-out buildings, had no idea that help was already moving toward them through the dark. The only question was whether it would arrive in time. Patton had made his promise. Eisenhower had said yes. And 133,000 men were already moving north through the dark. 3 days. That was all they had. But what nobody in that conference room fully understood yet was that moving the army was only half the problem. The other half was what was waiting for them on the other side. The Germans were not standing still. By December 20th, the day after Patton walked into Eisenhower's headquarters, the situation at Bastogne had gone from critical to catastrophic. 7 roads converged on that small Belgian town, which was precisely why both sides needed it so badly. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, had thrown the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division in a ring around the town. 18,000 American soldiers were completely encircled. Artillery ammunition was running so low that battery commanders were rationing shells. Doctors operated without anesthesia. Men tore strips from their own uniforms to use as bandages. The temperature dropped to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and the frozen ground made it impossible to dig proper foxholes. The Germans had 45,000 men surrounding Bastogne. The Americans inside had 18,000, and between Bastogne and Patton's advancing columns, there were 35 miles of snow ice and veteran German units who had been ordered to hold at all costs. Patton arrived back at his Nancy headquarters at 2:30 in the morning on December 20th. His staff had the movement orders already prepared. He looked at them for 90 seconds, made 2 changes, and said, "Send them." Within hours, coded messages were going out to every division commander in 3rd Army. The 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, the 81st Infantry Division. Each of them received the same essential instruction: you are no longer attacking east. You are attacking north. You move at dawn. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored, received the order at 4 o'clock in the morning. He later recalled standing in his command post, staring at the movement order in one hand and a weather report in the other. The weather report said 12 inches of snow expected. The movement order said his division, nearly 11,000 men and more than 200 tanks, needed to cover 150 miles and be ready to attack within 48 hours. He said he looked at both documents for a long time. Then he put them down and started giving orders because with Patton there was no alternative. The 4th Armored moved out at first light. The roads were a nightmare. Retreating 1st Army units were pushing south on the same roads that Patton's divisions needed to use going north. Belgian refugees were moving in every direction. Trucks jackknifed on icy curves and blocked traffic for miles. At one point near Arlon, a column of 4th Armored vehicles came to a complete stop behind a massive tangle of abandoned supply trucks that had slid off the road in the dark. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, was near the front of the column when it stopped. He climbed out of his tank and was trying to assess the situation when a jeep appeared from behind him at high speed, sliding to a stop on the ice. Patton stepped out. He did not ask what the problem was. He walked to the nearest truck driver and told him he had 5 minutes to get his vehicle off the road, or Abrams was going to push it into the ditch with a Sherman. Then he looked at Abrams directly and said, "Colonel, every hour you sit here is another American soldier dying in Bastogne. Move." The road was clear in 3 minutes. This scene repeated itself across 100 miles of Belgian roads over 2 days. Patton was everywhere. Not at his command post studying maps. Not waiting for staff reports. He was in his jeep moving up and down the columns, personally finding the bottlenecks, resolving them with the kind of authority that only comes from a 3-star general who will physically stand in the road and direct traffic himself if that is what it takes. His staff officers later said they spent those 2 days terrified. Not of the Germans. Of the fact that their commander was regularly within range of German artillery fire and seemed completely unbothered by this. By the evening of December 21st, the impossible was almost done. The 4th Armored had covered 150 miles. The 26th Infantry had marched through snow and sleet for 48 hours straight and was in position. The 81st Infantry had reoriented from attacking east to attacking north and covered nearly 100 miles. Colonel Paddy Flint, one of Patton's regimental commanders, told his men that evening that what they had just accomplished in 2 days would have taken any other army in the world 2 weeks. Then he told them to get 4 hours of sleep because they were attacking at dawn. That same night, December 21st, the German commander at Bastogne sent a delegation under a white flag to the American perimeter. The written ultimatum was formal, almost polite. It stated that further resistance was hopeless, that the Americans had one opportunity to surrender with honor. That refusal meant annihilation. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the garrison, read the ultimatum. Then he wrote his response on a single piece of paper and handed it to the German delegation. One word: nuts. His operations officer had to explain to the confused German officers what it meant. It means the officer told them, "Go to hell." McAuliffe was brave. The 101st Airborne was extraordinary. But courage alone does not stop panzer divisions, and by the night of December 21st, McAuliffe's men had approximately 24 hours of ammunition left. Maybe less. The Germans were attacking from 3 directions simultaneously. The perimeter was holding, but barely, and holding was not the same as surviving another week. Patton knew all of this. He sat in his command post on the evening of December 21st and wrote in his diary that everything depended on the next 48 hours. He also did something that surprised people who only knew his public image. He called his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, and asked him to write a prayer for good weather. The prayer asked God to restrain the rains and fog, to grant fair weather for battle. Patton had it printed on cards and distributed to every soldier in Third Army that night. Then he went to sleep for 4 hours. December 22, 1944. The artillery of the 3rd Corps opened fire at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. 300 guns. Simultaneous. The barrage hit German positions along the southern shoulder of the Bulge with a concentration of fire that shook the ground for 20 miles in every direction. 15 minutes later, the 4th Armored Division attacked north. The weather had broken. After days of snow and fog, the sky was clear and cold and blue. Allied aircraft could fly for the first time since the German offensive began. P-47 Thunderbolts were already in the air hunting German armor. C-47 transport planes were loading supplies at airfields across France for drops into Bastogne. The prayer, whether by coincidence or something else, had worked. The Germans were caught off balance. They had been focused forward, pushing west, driving for the Meuse. The southern flank had been considered secure. A major American counterattack from that direction in those conditions in that time frame was something that German operational planning had assessed as impossible. Their assessment was wrong. But impossible and easy are two different things entirely. The 5th Fallschirmjäger Division elite German paratroopers held positions in a belt of villages south of Bastogne. These were not conscripts or broken units. These were veterans who knew their terrain, had prepared their defenses, and had pre-registered artillery on every road approaching their positions. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams led his 37th Tank Battalion into the first major engagement near Martelange, and within 15 minutes, 3 Shermans were burning. He flanked through a forest that was not supposed to be passable, for armor broke through the German line and advanced 4 miles. It took all day. He lost 11 tanks. He destroyed 22 German guns and took 400 prisoners. 4 miles. 1 day. Bastogne was still 31 miles away. At his headquarters, staff officers began raising the question of consolidation, of pausing to reorganize supply lines, bring forward reserves, prepare properly for the next phase. The suggestion lasted approximately 30 seconds. Patton's response was recorded by Brigadier General Hobart Gay, his chief of staff. "The Germans expect us to stop. They expect caution. They expect us to worry about our flanks. We are not going to stop. We are going to attack through the night. We are going to attack through Christmas. We attack until we reach Bastogne, because if we don't, those men die. And if they die with help this close, I will never forgive myself, and neither will history." He ordered all division commanders to maintain continuous pressure through the night. No pauses, no consolidation. Every hour the enemy was given to rest and reorganize was an hour of American lives spent unnecessarily. December 23rd. The Luftwaffe appeared for one of its final major efforts, strafing American columns with FW-19OS. Allied P-47s and P-51s responded immediately. The air battle above the frozen Ardennes was savage and brief. The Allies had air superiority for the first time, and they used it. 241 C-47s flew supply missions into Bastogne, dropping 144 tons of ammunition, medicine, and food to the surrounded garrison. The paratroopers of the 101st watched the sky fill with parachutes and understood that the world had not forgotten them. On the ground, the fighting was brutal and grinding and personal. Tank duels at 400 yards. Infantry clearing farmhouses room by room in frozen darkness. The 26th Infantry Division lost 156 men in a single day, taking one village. The 4th Armored lost 39 tanks on December 23rd and destroyed 55 German tanks in return. The math favored Patton, but barely, and Bastogne was still miles away. Then came Christmas Eve. The 4th Armored was 12 miles from Bastogne. Between them and the garrison lay the village of Chaumont, held by the 5th Fallschirmjäger, with assault guns and minefields covering every approach. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams studied the position for a long time. There was no good option. A flanking maneuver would take days. A standard assault would be suicide. So he chose the third option that military doctrine did not officially recognize. He ordered his tanks into column and told them to go straight down the road at maximum speed and not stop for anything. At 100 in the afternoon on December 24th, Combat Command A roared toward Chaumont. The first Sherman was hit and stopped within seconds. The second swerved around it. The third was hit and kept moving with smoke pouring from its engine deck. The column did not stop. Abrams was in the fourth tank standing in the turret directing fire while his driver held the throttle wide open. The speed and the violence and the sheer refusal to slow down overwhelmed the German defenders. Within 2 hours, Chaumont was in American hands. Abrams lost 8 tanks and 53 men. He had broken the last major defensive line before Bastogne. 7 miles remained. The Germans were rushing every available unit to close the corridor before Patton could punch through. The 1st SS Panzer Division was moving. The 26th Volksgrenadier was preparing a counterattack for Christmas morning. The window that had opened at Chaumont was already beginning to close. Patton received the report at midnight. He sent one message to all his commanders. 4 sentences. We attack at dawn. No excuses, no delays. We reach Bastogne tomorrow, or we die trying. Somewhere in the dark, 18,000 American soldiers in a frozen Belgian town were still holding. They did not know that help was 7 miles away. They did not know that the corridor was closing as fast as it was opening. They did not know that the Germans had identified the threat and were now throwing everything they had left directly into the path of the 4th Armored Division. They were about to find out what Patton was made of. And so was everyone else. Patton had moved 133,000 men in 3 days. He had broken through the last German defensive line south of Bastogne on Christmas Eve. 7 miles remained. The corridor was open barely, and the Germans were throwing everything they had left to close it before dawn. Christmas morning, 1944. The coldest day in Belgian history. And the most important day of the entire Battle of the Bulge was about to begin. The Germans knew exactly what was happening. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the West, had received the intelligence reports on December 23rd. An entire American Army Corps had pivoted 90 degrees and moved 150 miles in conditions that his own staff had assessed as prohibitive for large-scale movement. His reaction, recorded by his aide, was a single sentence: "This is not possible." But the burning panzers south of Bastogne proved otherwise, and by Christmas Eve, von Rundstedt was on the telephone to Hitler personally, warning that the southern flank of the entire offensive was collapsing. Hitler's response was to order more attacks. Always more attacks. The 1st SS Panzer Division, which had been pushing west toward the Meuse, was ordered to turn south and destroy Patton's corridor before it could be widened. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division was ordered to seal the gap at all costs. German artillery was repositioned overnight to cover the roads leading north to Bastogne. Von Leutwitz, commanding the forces surrounding Bastogne, later told interrogators after the war that by Christmas morning he understood the offensive had failed. The Americans had done something his planning had considered mathematically impossible, and now the question was not whether Bastogne would be relieved, but how many German soldiers would die trying to prevent it. The answer was going to be a very large number. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, sent an urgent message to Army Group B headquarters on the morning of December 25th. The message stated that Patton's attack had achieved a penetration of the German southern flank that could not be sealed with available forces, and that unless significant reinforcements arrived within 24 hours, the entire German force surrounding Bastogne faced encirclement. The reinforcements never came. There were none to send. The German army in the West was burning through its last reserves, and Patton was the fire. Inside Bastogne that same morning, the situation had reached its absolute limit. McAuliffe's men had been on quarter rations for 3 days. Artillery shells were being rationed at 10 per gun per day. The 326th Airborne Medical Company was operating out of a bombed-out Belgian aid station with no anesthesia, no morphine, and bed sheets cut into strips for bandages. Men who had been fighting continuously since December 19th were running on cold coffee and will alone. The perimeter was holding. But holding had become a matter of hours rather than days. At 6:30 in the morning on December 25th, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams led his 37th Tank Battalion out of Chaumont in the dark before sunrise, before the German positions could be fully reinforced. The temperature was 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice covered every road. Visibility in the pre-dawn dark was almost nothing. He formed his tanks into a wedge and moved north. The first German resistance came at the village of Removille. Machine gun fire. Abrams did not stop. His tanks rolled through the village firing on the move infantry in half-tracks right behind them, dismounting to clear buildings while the armor kept pushing forward. Removille fell in 20 minutes. 7 Germans dead. 14 captured. 1 Sherman with a broken track left behind still firing to cover the advance. Clochemount next. German anti-tank guns in the tree line opened up at 400 yards. 2 Shermans hit. 1 burning. Abrams called artillery and kept moving. The barrage hit the tree line while his tanks were still advancing toward it. Dangerous. Necessary. The gun positions were destroyed before they could reload. Clochemount in 40 minutes. The column did not stop. By noon, Abrams was 4 miles from Bastogne. The Germans had established a final blocking position at the village of Assenois, approximately 500 soldiers with machine guns, Panzerfäusts, and 2 self-propelled guns covering the last road north. Every building was fortified. The church tower held a sniper and an observer calling artillery. Minefields covered the fields on both sides of the road. A textbook defensive position. Abrams studied it for 4 minutes. 4 minutes was all the time he had. He called Captain William Dwight, commanding C Company of the 37th, on the radio. "Dwight, you see that village?" "Yes, sir." "Go through it." Dwight later wrote that he asked no further questions because there were none worth asking. Either it worked or it didn't. At 4:15 in the afternoon, C Company attacked Assenois. 5 Shermans abreast, maximum speed. Artillery hitting the village simultaneously, the shells falling close enough that Dwight's driver later said he could feel the concussion through the tank hull. The lead tank hit a mine. The second tank swerved around it and crashed through the village gate. German soldiers ran. Some fought. Panzerfäusts fired from windows, one striking a Sherman on the turret and failing to penetrate. The self-propelled guns fired twice and were destroyed by return fire from 3 tanks simultaneously. The column roared through Assenois in 9 minutes, through the village up the road cresting a low ridge. And there, in the valley below, was Bastogne. American positions, smoke from artillery, the perimeter of the 101st Airborne, and soldiers standing in the open, staring north at the sound of tank engines, coming from a direction that for 6 days had held only Germans. At 4:45 in the afternoon on Christmas Day, 1944, Captain Dwight's Sherman made contact with the forward positions of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. He climbed out of his tank. A soldier from the 101st walked toward him through the snow. Dwight shook his hand and said, "Merry Christmas. We're from the 4th Armored. Patton sent us." The siege of Bastogne was broken. The corridor was 400 yards wide, barely wider than a country road. German forces immediately attacked from both sides to cut it, and the fighting to widen and hold the corridor was as brutal as anything that came before. But the strategic reality had shifted permanently. Medical supplies went in within the hour. Ammunition followed. The 101st Airborne, which had been defending with empty rifles and borrowed prayers, could fight again. Over the next 10 days, as Patton's forces expanded the corridor and pushed the Germans back across their start lines, the full scale of what had been accomplished became visible in the numbers. The German offensive, which had begun with 400,000 men and 9 panzer divisions, had suffered approximately 100,000 casualties. 600 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned. Irreplaceable fuel reserves expended. The Luftwaffe had lost 800 aircraft in the skies over the Ardennes, trying to support the offensive. And crucially, Germany had spent its last strategic reserve in the West. There was nothing left to stop the final Allied push into the Reich. Patton's Third Army had suffered 15,000 casualties in 10 days of continuous combat. The 4th Armored Division alone lost more than 1,000 men getting to Bastogne. But they had prevented what von Rundstedt later called the last opportunity Germany had to force a negotiated peace in the West. That opportunity was gone, and it was gone because one general had moved an army faster than anyone believed was physically possible. Eisenhower's message to Patton on December 26th was formal and brief, the language of official military communication. It called the relief of Bastogne a magnificent feat of arms. But the private phone call that followed, recorded by Eisenhower's aide Harry Butcher, who was present, was something different. Eisenhower told Patton simply, "George, you son of a bitch, you actually did it." Patton's response was vintage Patton. "I told you I would, Ike. Next time maybe you'll believe me from the start." German commanders who were interrogated after the war were remarkably consistent in their assessments. Von Rundstedt called it the most brilliant operation of the war. Von Manteuffel said Patton's movement of 3 divisions over that distance in those conditions in that time frame was something that German operational doctrine considered impossible. Heinrich von Luttwitz, whose Panzer Corps had been stopped by Patton's counterattack, told interrogators that when his intelligence officers confirmed the scale of the American movement, he submitted a report upward, recommending immediate withdrawal from the Bulge, because the offensive could no longer succeed. The report was rejected by Hitler. The offensive continued for another 3 weeks, but it was already over on Christmas Day in a 400-yard corridor carved through Belgian snow by Creighton Abrams and 5 Shermans. Military historians and staff colleges around the world have analyzed the relief of Bastogne for 80 years and continue to use it as the defining case study in operational tempo and aggressive command. The specific numbers are taught to every student of military logistics: 133,000 men, 75 miles, 72 hours in winter against opposition. No army before or since has moved at that scale and that speed under those conditions. But the numbers, as always, miss the essential point. The men who made that march possible later said consistently that they did not move 75 miles in 3 days because of superior equipment or brilliant logistics. They did it because Patton said they would. Captain William Dwight, writing home on January 2, 1945, put it plainly. "We did something we didn't think could be done. We moved faster and fought harder than we knew how. Why? Because Patton said we would. And with Patton, you don't question, you just do it." That belief that absolute confidence transmitted from a commander to the soldiers who followed him is the thing that no staff college curriculum has ever fully been able to quantify or replicate. It is also the thing that Eisenhower understood better than anyone when he stood across a conference room table on December 19th and decided to trust an audacious promise that every rational analysis in that room said was impossible. Bastogne was held. The Bulge was broken. Hitler's last offensive in the West was over. But there is one final chapter to this story. The chapter about what happened to the men who made it possible. About what Patton said 6 months later when the war in Europe ended. About what Eisenhower wrote in the years afterward when he had time to look back and reckon honestly with what that relationship between 2 extraordinary and opposite men had actually cost them both. About what Creighton Abrams, the young tank commander who led 5 Shermans through Versailles on Christmas afternoon, went on to become. That chapter is not widely told, and it changes everything you think you know about what victory actually looks like. From the moment Patton walked unannounced into Eisenhower's headquarters on December 19th, to the moment Creighton Abrams shook hands with a paratrooper outside Bastogne on Christmas afternoon, 6 days had passed. 6 days that changed the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge, ended Hitler's last offensive in the West, and demonstrated something about the nature of military command that armies are still trying to understand 8 decades later. The siege was broken. The corridor was open. But the question that nobody in that conference room on December 19th had thought to ask was simple and uncomfortable. What happens to men like George Patton when the war that needs them finally ends? Because the answer, it turns out, is not what anyone expected. George Smith. Patton Jr. did not live to see the full consequences of what he built. On December 9, 1945, less than 8 months after Germany surrendered, Patton was riding in his staff car near Mannheim, Germany, when a military truck made a sudden turn and the vehicles collided at low speed. The crash was not violent by any conventional measure. Nobody else in either vehicle was seriously injured. But Patton was thrown forward, struck the partition behind the driver's seat, and suffered a fracture of the 3rd cervical vertebra. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He died 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, exactly 1 year and 4 days after his artillery opened fire south of Bastogne. He was 60 years old. He never went home. He never saw his grandchildren grow up. He never sat on the porch of a quiet house somewhere in Massachusetts and watched the ordinary world turn without him. The man who had moved 133,000 soldiers across 75 miles of frozen Belgian countryside in 3 days died in a military hospital in Heidelberg from injuries sustained in a minor traffic accident, and the irony of that ending haunted everyone who knew him. Beatrice Patton, his wife of 36 years, was at his bedside when he died. She later said that the thing she remembered most clearly was how peaceful he looked, which was something he had almost never been in life. She buried him at his request in Luxembourg with the soldiers of 3rd Army who had died in the Battle of the Bulge. He had said he wanted to be where his men were. He is there still in a military cemetery above the Alzette River, surrounded by 5,076 American graves. Eisenhower received the news of Patton's death at his headquarters in Frankfurt. His aide recorded that Eisenhower went very quiet for a long time after being told. Then he said, "He was the greatest field commander in the history of the American Army. I know of no other man who could have done what he did." He paused. Then he added something that did not appear in official records, but was written down by the aide privately that evening. "And I know that I never told him that enough." The men who followed Patton through those December roads had their own reckonings with his death. Creighton Abrams, the young lieutenant colonel who had led his tanks through Assenois on Christmas afternoon, heard the news in an occupation billet in Germany and told his executive officer that he felt like something fundamental had gone out of the war, even though the war was already over. Abrams was 30 years old. He had commanded tanks at Bastogne, crossed the Rhine, raced through Bavaria, and ended the war with more decorations than most generals twice his age. He had learned everything he knew about armored warfare from watching Patton operate. About speed, about audacity, about the principle that hesitation costs more lives than boldness. Those lessons did not go with Patton into the Luxembourg ground. They traveled forward into the next generation of American military command, carried by men like Abrams, who had learned them in the frozen Ardennes during the most demanding military operation of the European War. Creighton Abrams went on to command American forces in Vietnam. He redesigned the entire strategic approach to that war, shifting from large-scale search and destroy operations toward a combined arms strategy that the military theorists of the era called privately Patton's doctrine, applied to a different century. He became Army Chief of Staff. And when the United States needed a new main battle tank in the 1970s, the machine that emerged from that program was named the M1 Abrams. It is still the primary tank of the United States Army today. Every M1 Abrams that has fought in the Gulf War in Iraq and Afghanistan carries the name of the man who learned armored warfare by leading 5 Shermans through a Belgian village on Christmas Day, because Patton told him to go through it and not stop for anything. That is one line of inheritance, but there are others. The operational principles that Patton demonstrated at Bastogne. The idea that speed is itself a form of protection, that tempo disorganizes an enemy faster than firepower. that audacious movement through difficult terrain in impossible conditions can achieve. What careful planning never will became the theoretical foundation of air-land battle doctrine, the American military's core operational concept through the Cold War and into the 1990s. When General Norman Schwarzkopf designed the left hook that destroyed the Iraqi Republican Guard in 100 hours during Desert Storm in 1991, his planning staff referenced the Bastogne relief operation specifically as the model for what rapid armored movement could achieve against an opponent who expected caution. The 7th Corps swept 200 miles through the Iraqi desert in 4 days. The intellectual DNA of that movement ran directly back to December 1944, to a conference room in Versailles, where one general promised to move an army in 3 days, and another general decided to believe him. Military staff colleges in 17 countries teach the Bastogne relief as a case study in operational tempo. The specific metrics are part of the curriculum: 133,000 men, 75 miles, 72 hours. Winter conditions, active enemy opposition, 0 logistical preparation time. Students are asked to analyze whether the operation was possible according to standard planning factors. The answer by every standard formula is no. Then they are asked why it succeeded anyway. The answer to that question is the actual lesson, and it has nothing to do with logistics tables or planning factors. It has to do with what a commander transmits to the soldiers who follow him when he stands in front of them and says, "We will do this," without qualification, without hedging, without the cautious language of institutional self-protection. Patton never hedged. That was his great flaw and his defining strength simultaneously. And Eisenhower spent 4 years managing the distance between those two things. He shielded Patton from dismissal after the slapping incidents. He sidelined him after the Soviet comments. He brought him back for Sicily, for the breakout across France for the Bulge, because each time the situation became desperate enough, there was only one commander in the Allied order of battle who could look at desperate and see opportunity. The lesson that military historians have drawn from that relationship is not about Patton's genius in isolation. Genius in isolation is useless or worse. The lesson is about Eisenhower's judgment, which was the judgment to know when to release the thing he was managing and let it run. Every rational voice in that conference room on December 19th said Patton's timeline was impossible. Every logistics officer, every British liaison, every staff planner with a pad of paper and a knowledge of movement rates in winter conditions said it could not be done in 3 days. Eisenhower listened to all of them, and then he looked at Patton and said yes. That decision, that willingness to trust audacity over caution at the precise moment when caution felt safest, is the thing that military theorists still argue about, and organizations outside the military still fail to learn. Every institution that has ever told an unconventional thinker that the timeline was unrealistic, that the approach violated established procedure, that the idea was interesting but needed more study, has repeated the dynamic that played out in that conference room. Most of the time, those institutions were right to be cautious. Patton was not always right either. His career was littered with catastrophic misjudgments that Eisenhower had to manage and contain. The lesson is not that audacity is always correct. The lesson is that sometimes the cost of caution is higher than the cost of being wrong, and knowing which situation you are in is the hardest judgment in leadership. Now here is the detail that most accounts of the Bastogne relief leave out entirely, the thing that sits at the end of this story and reframes everything that came before it. On December 16, 1944, the day the German offensive began, Patton convened his staff and ordered contingency plans prepared for 3 different counterattack scenarios. He did this before he had orders to do it, before Eisenhower had any idea what was happening, before most Allied commanders had even understood the scale of what had hit them. He designated units, alerted supply officers, and began the preparatory work for a movement that he had not yet been authorized to execute. He did this because he had been watching the German army for 3 years, and he understood, in the way that deep professional knowledge creates intuition that outpaces formal analysis, that the Ardennes sector was vulnerable and that Hitler would eventually try something there. In the days after the relief of Bastogne, when journalists and staff officers pressed him for an explanation of how he had prepared so quickly, Patton gave a characteristically blunt answer that most of them took as arrogance and moved past. He said, "I knew they were going to do it. I just didn't know exactly when." The statement was dismissed as retrospective self-congratulation by the skeptics and celebrated as genius by the admirers, and both groups missed the actual point. The actual point was that Patton had spent 20 years thinking harder about armored warfare than almost anyone else in any army in the world, and that preparation, that accumulation of specific professional knowledge applied to a specific professional problem, was what allowed him to be planning a counterattack on December 16th, while other commanders were still receiving casualty reports. The planning was not inspiration. It was the result of 20 years of work that looked from the outside like obsession and arrogance and difficulty, and that looked from the inside like a man who had decided that his job was to think about war more seriously than anyone else, and never stop. The ivory-handled revolvers and the profanity and the theatrical self-presentation were the part that newspapers wrote about. The 20 years of reading, writing, thinking, and preparing were the part that broke the siege of Bastogne. George Patton moved 133,000 men across 75 miles of frozen Belgium in 72 hours, attacked through blizzards and veteran German panzer divisions, and reached Bastogne on Christmas Day, 1944, with ammunition and medicine, and the proof that the encircled garrison was not forgotten. He saved the lives of 18,000 surrounded soldiers, shattered Hitler's last strategic offensive in the West, and shortened the war in Europe by months. Which means that the number of lives his audacity saved extends far beyond the men inside that perimeter. He died 8 months after the war ended without going home, and he is buried in Luxembourg with the soldiers he led, which is exactly where he said he wanted to be. From a general who could not sleep and would not wait, who drove 175 miles through the night to make a promise that every rational voice in the room said was impossible. The question was answered on Christmas afternoon in a 400-yard corridor carved through Belgian snow. Sometimes the impossible is just something nobody has tried yet. Sometimes the cost of caution is measured in the lives of the people who needed someone to come faster than anyone thought was possible. And sometimes, the most important thing a leader can do is walk through a door without knocking, look at a map, and say, "We can attack on the 22nd. Because I've already been planning this for 3 days, and I've got hold of the handle.